Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Cynthia Watros did not simply portray Nina Reeves as a role to be performed, she lived her through every breath, every glance, and every aching silence. As a seasoned actress, Cynthia brought years of experience and technical precision to the character, but what made her portrayal truly unforgettable was the raw, unfiltered vulnerability she infused into every scene. She approached Nina not as a villain or a victim, but as a deeply flawed, deeply human woman, one whose life had been marked by longing, loss, and the desperate hunger for love and redemption. In recent interviews, Cynthia opened up about the emotional toll the role has taken on her, especially during scenes of conflict with Caitlin McMullen, who plays Willow. She revealed that these emotionally charged confrontations often left her in tears long after the director had called cut, unable to fully detach from the anguish Nina was experiencing. Watching Caitlin's tear-filled eyes and feeling the palpable heartbreak in the room reminded Cynthia that they were not merely telling a story, but excavating real emotional truths, about abandonment, reconciliation, and the fragile threads that bind mothers and daughters. For Cynthia, filming the wedding episode in which Willow confronts Drew about his betrayal was a moment of profound collapse, not just for Nina, but for herself. She described the scene as one of the most harrowing of her career, explaining that it didn't require any acting. The pain, the grief, and the helplessness came not from her imagination, but from a well of empathy so deep it blurred the line between performer and character. As Nina watched from the sidelines while her daughter's life unraveled at the altar, Cynthia found herself overcome with the very same heartbreak, a mother forced to witness her child sacrifice her happiness, her dignity, and perhaps even her future, all for the sake of clinging to motherhood. Cynthia admitted that in those moments, she no longer felt like she was playing Nina. She was Nina, standing on that razor's edge between love and loss, screaming silently to be seen and understood. What elevates Cynthia's work beyond the standard is her insistence on emotional authenticity. In what many have called the breaking point of the season, Nina declares to Ava, "That's it. Enough. I'm done." A line not in the script but delivered instinctively by Cynthia during filming. The weight of the line silenced the set, and the director, recognizing the power of the unscripted moment, decided to keep it. Cynthia later reflected on that spontaneous outburst as one of the purest moments of acting in her career. It was, as she put it, not performance but possession, a moment where every mother who had ever failed, every woman who had ever been misunderstood, cried out through her voice. That unfiltered honesty became the soul of Nina Reeves, transforming her from a dramatic character to a mirror of real-life pain. Even off-screen, Cynthia couldn't shake the hold that Nina had on her. She confessed to lying awake at night, plagued by the thought of whether she herself would have the courage to take the fall for her child the way Nina had. She found herself haunted by the questions the storyline posed: how far would you go to protect your child? What would you sacrifice to repair a bond you once thought unbreakable? The reactions from fans were just as complex. Cynthia said she received everything from angry messages condemning Nina's behavior to tearful letters thanking her for portraying a mother who, though broken, never stopped trying. One letter stood out. A viewer wrote, "I hate Nina because she reminds me too much of my own mother." It was in that moment Cynthia realized the true power of storytelling, not to entertain, but to reflect, to stir, to awaken. Cynthia calls Nina the role of a lifetime. Not because of accolades or acclaim, but because of the depth it demanded from her. The character forced her to plumb the darkest corners of emotional truth, to embody contradictions, to live in the dissonance of being both wrong and right at the same time. Nina was jealous, manipulative, and often irrational, but also fiercely loving, heartbreakingly hopeful, and endlessly resilient. Cynthia believes this complexity is what makes Nina unforgettable. She wasn't written to be liked. She was written to be understood, and Cynthia dedicated herself fully to ensuring that understanding came through. What moved Cynthia most deeply were the moments when fans reached out, not to talk about the drama or the plot twists, but to share how Nina had touched something raw and personal in them. Many spoke of fractured relationships with their own mothers, of regrets and missed chances, of the ache of wanting to say, "I'm sorry," or "I forgive you," and not knowing how. Cynthia often found herself responding not as an actress, but as a fellow human being, humbled by the realization that her work had given people language for pain they'd carried silently for years. There was no greater reward, she said, than hearing that Nina, flawed, desperate, and beautifully broken Nina, had helped someone feel less alone. In her own words, Cynthia described Nina's story as a beautiful tragedy, the kind of role that actors dream about but rarely receive. It demanded courage. Not just to cry on cue or deliver impassioned monologues, but to let the character into her soul. Whether Nina is ultimately redeemed or condemned by the show's narrative is secondary to Cynthia. What matters to her is that the character lived truthfully, painfully, and unapologetically. That she wasn't just a villain or a victim, but a woman fighting like hell to hold on to something, anything, that resembled love. As the storyline continues to unfold, and as Nina's relationship with Willow teeters between ruin and reconciliation, Cynthia remains at the heart of that emotional storm, anchoring every twist with a performance that is as technically masterful as it is emotionally courageous. In Nina's silent stares, her trembling hands, her frantic justifications, we don't just see a character. We see Cynthia's heart, wide open, beating for every woman who's ever tried and failed and tried again to be a mother, a daughter, a human being worthy of love. And whether the audience forgives Nina or not, Cynthia Watros has already achieved something far greater. She's made us feel. She could not stop herself from drowning in the truth that screamed relentlessly in her mind, that it was she, Nina, and her silence, her delay, her fear of rejection, that had ignited this chaos. The wedding had not been a celebration, not a new beginning as it should have been. It had become a haunting requiem, and Nina stood on the periphery like a ghost of her own regrets. In the golden light filtering through the windows of that lavish venue, she watched Willow, her daughter, trade her heart, her dignity, even her sense of self, just for the right to hold on to her children. And in that moment, Nina couldn't help but wonder whether Willow would ever be free from the shadows that clung to her life like ivy, choking out any semblance of joy. Nina knew she was part of that darkness. No matter how hard she had tried to claw her way toward redemption, her presence had become a wound that never healed, a reminder of betrayals that still echoed. When the truth of her intimate relationship with Drew surfaced, it was not the public reaction that shattered Willow. It was the private earthquake, invisible to most, that Nina saw as clear as day. Everyone else saw shock, but Nina recognized despair. The void in Willow's eyes wasn't the sharp edge of rage, it was the hollow grief of someone who had been abandoned over and over again. Nina knew that pain too well. She had lived it herself. And now, to be the cause of that same agony in her child made Nina's soul tremble. Willow wasn't just reacting to Drew's betrayal. She was unraveling under the weight of a lifetime of disappointment. Every man she had trusted had lied. Every woman she had dared to love as a mother had hidden something devastating. And now Nina, after coming so close to rebuilding that fragile bridge, had detonated it with one devastating omission. Nina wanted to reach for her, to speak, to scream, to say that her hesitation hadn't been born of selfishness, but of paralyzing fear. That she couldn't bear the thought of Willow shutting her out forever. But there were no words strong enough to cross the distance growing between them with every breath. That gap wasn't just emotional, it was existential. It was built from years of silence, mistrust, and deep wounds that no confession could ever fully close. Nina found herself surrounded by cold glares, Michael's contempt, Carly's judgment, and the relentless shadow of Drew's manipulation. And yet, somewhere within her, a quiet resolve stirred. She whispered to herself, again and again, that one day Willow might forgive her. Even if that day never came, even if she had to walk through fire to earn it, she would keep believing. It was all she had left. Then came the leak, the revelation that Willow had secretly followed Daisy. Drew seized it like a weapon, threatening to expose Willow in court, destroy her credibility, and use it as leverage to isolate her from the children. Nina froze. This, she knew, was the final threshold. The last fragile thread of peace Willow was clinging to could snap at any moment. Nina had failed to shield her once, when she didn't speak up about Drew. She would not fail again. Without a second thought, she stepped forward, took the blame, and wove a narrative around herself, one that painted her as obsessive, jealous, and petty. She claimed it was she who had followed Daisy, driven by mistrust of Sasha, consumed by maternal suspicion. She fabricated a motive, wrapped it in bitterness, and delivered it with conviction. Every lie was a dagger she willingly drove into her own reputation, just to draw attention away from Willow. Nina did not expect gratitude. She didn't even expect to be believed. Her only hope was that this sacrifice would buy her daughter the chance to walk a few more steps in peace. If she had to be the villain in everyone's story so Willow could remain the mother of her children without legal persecution, then so be it. She did not need to be loved. She only needed Willow to be safe. And if someday, her grandchildren asked why their grandmother had disappeared, why she become the outcast everyone whispered about, she would take comfort in knowing that her actions gave them a mother who wasn't dragged through the mud in court. That was enough. That was everything. Michael, ever calculating, wasn't fully convinced. He sniffed out inconsistencies, sensed an undertone of misplaced martyrdom. But even with his suspicions, he lacked the evidence to unravel Nina's confession. He watched, wary, as the pieces fell into place, yet part of him, too, began to question the ease with which Nina threw herself into the fire. It was not the strategy of a liar. It was the gesture of someone who had nothing left to lose. While Port Charles debated whether Nina was a manipulator or a madwoman, Willow spiraled deeper into guilt. She knew. She knew her mother was lying. She had seen that same self-sacrificing glint in Nina's eyes before, years ago, when Nina first begged for a place in her life. And now it returned, quietly, devastatingly. What broke Willow wasn't the lie, it was the love behind it. She had never wanted Nina's protection. She had never asked for her mother to bleed for her. But now that it was happening, now that she was watching Nina dismantle her own life, her own identity, brick by brick to shield her, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Gratitude. And then shame for feeling it. For the first time, she didn't see Nina as the woman who had wrecked her world. She saw her as someone trying, desperately and imperfectly, to do the right thing. And it hurt. Because Willow remembered being a child, alone, yearning for someone to show up and say, "I will fight for you." And here Nina was, years too late, wrapped in scandal and mistake, finally saying it, not with words, but with action. Willow felt a part of herself crumble. That abandoned little girl within her cried not for Michael, not for Carly, not even for Drew, but for Nina. For the mother who had missed every milestone, every bedtime story, every scraped knee, but still stood now, refusing to let her fall again. And for all the pain, for all the lies, for all the years they'd spent apart, this heartbreaking act of self-destruction, was the first time Willow truly felt protected. Not by the people who had always claimed to be her saviors, but by the woman she had spent so long trying to hate. And in that moment, she no longer could. In the violent churn of emotional reckoning that had engulfed her, Nina clung to the shards of maternal love with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. Everything she had ever wanted, to be called Mom, to be trusted, to be seen not as a manipulative outsider but as someone worthy of a place in Willow's heart, was now impossibly out of reach. The damage had been done, and the opportunity to undo it had passed. But in the ruins of that fractured relationship, Nina found a singular clarity. If she could no longer be loved, she could still protect. If she could no longer be forgiven, she could still sacrifice. And that knowledge, though painful, gave her a strange kind of peace. She embraced the reality that she might be the villain in the eyes of the court, in the tabloids, and perhaps even in the heart of her daughter. She might be arrested, prosecuted, and condemned. She might be left entirely alone, with no one at her side, not even Ava, not even Sunny. But if it meant Willow could remain by her children's side, if it meant no one would question her fitness as a mother, then every ounce of suffering was a price Nina was willing to pay. She didn't make the sacrifice with any expectation of reward. She knew there would be no public redemption arc, no grand gesture that would suddenly wash away the years of mistrust. Her gesture would not be seen as noble. If anything, people would sneer, accuse her of deceit, of interfering again, of drawing attention to herself in yet another twisted ploy for relevance. But none of that mattered anymore. Nina was no longer chasing acceptance. She was no longer reaching for the unattainable dream of being embraced without suspicion. All she wanted, was for Willow to have a future that was clean, untarnished, uninterrupted by scandal or shame. She wanted her daughter to be able to tuck her children in at night without fearing that one wrong move would rip them away. And if the only way to secure that was to soil her own name, then she would do so gladly. When she watched Willow, exhausted and shaking, cradle Amelia in her arms while the world around them spun in confusion and uncertainty, something in Nina shifted. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't even pride. It was belonging, in its most painful and complicated form. She had spent so long lingering on the fringes of Willow's life, watching her from the shadows, making mistakes in her effort to inch closer. But now, in this moment, where the lie Nina told kept Willow safe, she felt like she was finally inside the story, finally part of her daughter's reality, even if only as the silent protector in the background. It was not the role she had envisioned for herself, but it was a role she embraced with every fiber of her being. Because this wasn't just a story about a broken mother and a bitter daughter. It had become something far more haunting, a testament to what happens when love is buried under too many years of silence, when guilt becomes its own kind of devotion, and when forgiveness is so far removed that the only remaining path to connection is through shared pain. The tragedy of Nina and Willow was not in the yelling or the betrayals. It was in the quiet moments where nothing could be said, where the space between them was thick with all the words left unspoken, the apologies never uttered, the embraces that had come too late. Their love had curdled under the weight of time and error, and yet it still pulsed, damaged, desperate, but alive. And Nina, in her final act of defiance against that slow decay, chose to give up the last thing she had, her own future. She was not ignorant of what was at stake. By taking the blame, she was implicating herself in something that could spiral into criminal charges. She could be held in contempt. She could be dragged into custody. She could spend her days isolated, branded again as unstable, meddling, incapable of letting go. And more painfully, she could be cut off permanently from the very person she was trying to save. But Nina no longer feared isolation. She had known its taste all her life. From her days in a coma, to her slow and painful reintegration into society, to the constant rejection from those she longed to love. She had learned to live without comfort. What she had never learned to live without, however, was purpose. And now, that purpose had crystallized. She existed not to be a part of Willow's life, but to shield it from further harm. It was not glamorous. It was not hopeful. But it was real. And it gave her the strength to endure whatever consequences would follow. Even Michael, so often cold and calculating, began to question the narrative as he watched Nina take the blows with such calm resolve. His instincts screamed manipulation, but his gut wavered. Why would she do this? Why now, when her own stability was hanging by a thread? He couldn't reconcile the image of the conniving Nina he had always battled with this version, this quiet woman accepting the ruin of her life without complaint. And while he still didn't trust her, a sliver of doubt crept in. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something genuine beneath the facade. Willow, meanwhile, unraveled in silence. She knew Nina was lying. Knew that her mother was placing herself in the line of fire for something she hadn't done. But what haunted her most wasn't the lie, it was what it meant. For all the mistakes Nina had made, for all the grief she had caused, she was now standing up in the most self-destructive way imaginable and saying, "Let me take this." And that act cracked something open in Willow's heart, a dam she had built so carefully to contain the need, the longing, the sorrow of never having had a mother to count on. Now, here Nina was, offering not words, not explanations, but action. Unquestioning, unwavering, irreversible. It was the first time in Willow's life that she felt truly defended. Not by Michael, whose love had grown conditional. Not by Carly, whose support came with quiet expectations. But by Nina. Flawed, impulsive, maddening Nina, who, for once, asked for nothing in return. And that terrified Willow more than anything else. Because it meant the narrative she had clung to, that Nina was irredeemable, toxic, dangerous, was no longer holding up. And if that was no longer true, then what else had she gotten wrong? So she held Amelia a little tighter. She let her tears fall freely. And deep within, a war raged. Between the daughter who had every right to hate, and the child who had always, quietly, wished to be loved. Nina would never know this conflict. She would never hear the soft sobs behind closed doors, never read the unsent letters, never witness the internal reckoning Willow now faced. But it didn't matter. Because love, real, maternal love, wasn't about winning. It was about giving everything you had, even if it left you empty. And Nina was empty now. But for the first time, she felt full. In the end, Nina stood in the quiet aftermath of her sacrifice, a shadow of the woman she once was, but strangely at peace.